I hope everyone has had a chance to get a caffeine jolt. We'd like to resume because we want to try to get more or less on schedule. I just want to let everyone know that we're going to, so I'm a teacher. I don't know, then I struggle with what the hell I do when my students aren't paying any attention. So now I hope I'm not treating you like students, but just want to, we have a couple of more engaging presentations. We'll have one more presentation this morning, then we will have a really terrific catered lunch. Then there'll be one more presentation, then we'll have two breakout groups, one on homelessness and poverty and one on women's issues in poverty. Everything is planned to be over by 3:30 because we learned in the prior two conferences that people really are exhausted by early afternoon. So we're going to try to keep your interest as long as we can. I'd just like to call our dean to the podium once more to introduce the next set of presenters. Thank you.
Carl, thanks for really kicking things off and getting us thinking. A good philosopher helps us rethink all of our assumptions that we have forgotten even exist. And I think today the opening presentation really did a wonderful job stirring us up in really questioning and re-examining basic assumptions. And I'm very grateful for it, learned a lot from the presentation. The next presentation is called 3 Approaches to Fostering Financial Capability. And I'm not going to go into detail about each presenter, but because you can read about it in the program, they're all wonderfully credentialed. I do want to make a couple remarks about them. David Stiffler, I met a number of years ago because of a mutual friend. David is, to me, one of America's thought leaders in the area of restoring in creative and important ways, rebuilding communities that have been devastated and rebuilding families through all kinds of creative use of capital and credit, things that people in social work like myself aren't necessarily familiar with and we're not necessarily trained in. But he is Vice President of Global Corporate Responsibility for Equifax, and he's working in Atlanta, St. Louis, Toronto, London, and Madrid on major community rebuilding initiatives. I've had the privilege of working with David in the classroom at the Brown School in Washington University, St. Louis, and also to visit the community, part of the community in St. Louis that Equifax and partners have been investing in heavily, of working with entrepreneurs and small business owners and families who are really benefiting. And social workers are very much involved in that effort. And I'm grateful also David has come down and spent time with our faculty, and I'm relying on him as we continue to build new initiatives at the college to continue to help us think carefully about it. So you're in for a treat listening to him talk about very creative, exciting ways to think about how to marshal capitalism on behalf of the least advantaged, which I think is really brave and really fun and intellectually stimulating. David has introduced us to Kirby Burkholder, who's president of Social Impact Accelerator, And I've only gotten to know him for a few hours, but I'm very excited for his presence, not only because David has a great deal of respect and admiration for his work, but just for the record and getting on your website, Kirby, and looking at the work you're doing. In his current position as president, he's managing IFF's research and evaluation practice, talent management, proactive real estate development efforts, comprehensive place-based initiatives, and then special teams such as transforming sectors such as early childhood education, schools, and housing for people with disabilities. So I don't know even how he has time to come here and do this with that kind of portfolio. But I think Kirby represents the kind of social entrepreneurship and social innovation that I hope our students and faculty and everybody here will be interested in learning more about, because I really think this is an important part of our future, not only in social work, but in social policy work, economics, business, et cetera, really developing these very important partnerships and often counterintuitive partnerships. So Kirby, welcome. We'll look forward to your remarks. And then finally, an old friend, Jenny Jones, or Dr. Jenny Jones, Dean Jenny Jones. You know, we deans are very sensitive about our titles. And professor at Clark Atlanta University. We both met each other when we were deep into doing child welfare work. Jenny was at the University of Tennessee, Nashville, and I was at the University of Kentucky Center for Trauma and Children, and she was kind enough to invite me down to give some talks and meet with people around innovations around assessment and treatment of maltreated kids, and immediately fell in love with Jenny because of her energy, her irreverence, her rebelliousness. Why either of us are deans is still a question we don't understand. I've asked her please not to say anything that would give away the game. But she's dean and professor now of the Whitney M. Young School, Junior School of Social Work at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta. And she's 20 years of professional experience as an administrator in higher education, child welfare, and multi-service organizations. What I'm excited about Jenny talking about today is how she is innovating around social work education to join the work of people like Kirby and David, and thinking about the next generation of what we ought to be thinking about in social work, but also more broadly in higher education to fulfill the kinds of moral obligations that Carl so beautifully laid out. Even if not everybody in the room agrees with his remedies, the moral obligation he laid out in very clear and stark terms, which I admire. And I'm so pleased that we can invite these three next speakers to talk about how they're addressing these in their very innovative, creative, social entrepreneurship work in different sectors of our economy. So first we're going to hear from David Stiffler, my friend, and who I think is one of the thought leaders in the United States right now in this area. David.
Good morning. Excellent. It's great to be here. My colleagues Kirby and Jenny and I are really thrilled. We find these types of environments to be highly energizing, and I think Carl's introduction to the strategic or philosophical overview to poverty mitigation or amelioration is critical, because we're going to talk to you about our different vantage points on how we're making investments and how we're trying to influence positive outcomes for people's lives who are in vulnerable communities. Before I start, how many folks in this room are renters? Quite a few. Great. I'm going to come back to that later. How many folks in this room know what Equifax is? Yeah, you've probably heard of us recently, right? 2017 was it's a pretty notable year for Equifax. But for those of you who may be new to Equifax, we're one of the 3 main credit bureaus in the world. In its most simplest form, what the bureaus do is assess risk, right? We use data to talk to lenders and convince lenders that you can get a car, you can get a home, that you're eligible for work. So credit counts. It's a critical part of all of our lives. And I didn't really fundamentally understand it until I went to work for this company about 13 years ago. So my background, I'm from St. Louis. I've lived in different parts of this country. I've now been with Equifax for 13 years, and I've essentially built this function for the company. One more question for you. How many of you feel that corporate America can be a true partner in this type of work? Great. We should be, right? I have some skepticism myself about the role of corporate America in the work around poverty or economic inclusion or financial capability. But a little bit about me. I'm St. Louis, father of 2 boys who are home right now. One's sick, one's just done being sick. My wife works. That's Lincoln, my oldest, who's eating the chip right there, and Langston, my youngest. They're the biggest part of my life. So for me, my growth as a leader in the corporate social responsibility space has been an evolution, and it might surprise you, but I work with social workers on a daily basis. In fact, this presentation was produced by one of my MSWs because I believe that quality communication skills are one of the big things you should take away from your education. But you probably heard corporate social responsibility. CSV, I'm going to talk about a little bit more. The consulting firms out there, Boston Consulting Firm has produced recently TSI, which is Total Societal Impact. But it's basically the frameworks and the articulation of how companies and corporations are thinking about their investments in community. And I think we've all seen examples of poor investments by corporations, or investments that are predominantly characterized, that are transactional, they're philanthropically based or foundationally based in charity, and we heard Carl talk about that. I too think philanthropy is very problematic, especially in the corporate space. It creates winners and it creates losers. So if you're ex-corporation and you like education, you're going to pick Teach for America. You know, if you're ex-corporation and you want to talk about housing, it's going to be Habitat for Humanity. It tends to be investments defined by the corporation, not by the community and not by the needs out there. So for us, creating shared value is a framework that we now adhere to. And I don't stick too strongly to this alphabet soup of definitions, but what I've seen from Equifax is that historically, we're a 125-year-old company now, that we too had predominantly engaged in community work through philanthropy. Now, we're almost a $4 billion company. We're in about 25 different countries, and we only use about $2.9 million a year in philanthropy. And so you think about that, and you think, what can you truly do with that? But if you start to think about the full value proposition of a company like Equifax, which is pushing into data and analytics and pushing into technology, if you think about those assets and the needs that exist, we can talk about shared value for all of us. And again, as you all move into your worlds of work or exist as faculty, when you come across people like me, don't ask us for money, ask us for true partnership, because companies have a lot of assets and a lot of value, and they're not fully realizing that. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. So Larry Fink's made a lot of news. He's a big CEO of a private equity firm in New York City, and starting about 3 years ago, he started to produce these letters, which kind of caused a panic. And what he basically said is for the major public companies in the U.S. and beyond, they are going to stop giving them capital to do their work unless these corporations and companies can better articulate their social mission, their social impact. It's quite a challenge, and people have paid attention. And for me, it reinforced what I've learned after 13 years. That predominantly my bosses, minus a few, will not pay attention to my work if it's purely philanthropic, if it's purely volunteerism, if it's feel-good. They may show up for a habitat build, maybe, most likely they'll cancel at the last minute, but they will pay attention if their bottom line is tied to expectations around social impact. And we're seeing more and more corporations strongly consider this. We're seeing the rise of what are called B Corps, right? So the Patagonias or Ben & Jerry's, the companies that are being formed now to explicitly drive social impact and revenue. And that's a more, to me, authentic space for conversations like me to have with you to occur. If I can talk about the way that we're using our data to support your work, because as social workers, evidence-based is bandied about all the time, right? But too often, I don't see that evidence. Equifax has economic evidence of what's happening where you are, and what's changing. So the case for us and what I've put into, built inside of Equifax now is creating shared value. It came out of Harvard in 2011, Michael Porter. And again, I think this is fairly self-explanatory, except that, again, when I interact with a lot of my counterparts in corporate America, they're not working with you. They're not working with social workers. They're not listening to the Carls of the world to inform their decisions, which, again, are largely decisions that are based in a very insular environment, which is how do corporate investments reflect well on the brand, and do our people like what we're doing? And it discounts what we should be doing as corporations with all of our resources to drive impact in multiple different ways in multiple different environments. Shared value, again, I think a lot of this is pretty self-evident. I use a big chunk of this presentation to present at Washington University in St. Louis. I've been an adjunct there now for 7 years. I teach or co-teach a macro-level class in organizations and communities. I teach a very specific class on creating shared value and grant making now. But the shared value model is one that we very much believe in the broad strokes. So here's another example of the impact of social work upon me. I have a bachelor's degree in English Lit with a specialization in Shakespeare, and I have a master's degree in screenwriting, if you can believe that. So I was living in Los Angeles trying to write screenplays about SNCC, about civil rights leaders. Didn't work out. I'm an introvert. LA's not for introverts, just so you know. Moved back to St. Louis and took this job at Equifax as an entry-level coordinator in an HR function. And like I mentioned before, I've built what we currently adhere to. But everything you see here should resonate. You guys understand this. This is what you're being taught. This is what you're being charged with, to live out your professional lives along lines like these. So we adhere to this now in the ways that we see opportunities. And those opportunities are continually broadening because of this. So it's self-reinforcing, right? One of the great stories I tell is that our former CEO was in St. Louis for a big meeting, and I presented. And I used a logic model, which my MSWs had taught me. And in the room, these top corporate leaders were like, oh my God, that is the most amazing way to convey information. So really, like activities, inputs, outputs, and then outcomes, that's amazing, but they loved it. So I didn't tell them because they'd probably think it would be antithetical to their general worldview that this is a social worker's tool and has been for a very long time, as is this framework here. I use this as well. It means more for me and maybe less to you, but we have a lot of young workers inside of Equifax. And they're bringing with them an expectation that's largely different than previous generations. And that difference is butting heads. So we have an older generation of predominantly white men who are still running the company. And they're running up against an expectation that says, hey, what are we doing? I don't want to hear about volunteer opportunities. I don't want to hear about that we gave money to a junior achievement or some different NGO. I want to hear and I want to work for a company that is directly addressing issues of economic inclusion or financial capability. And if companies like mine can't better articulate what that is, they'll lose these workers. And that's an expense. And that's how I talk about this work inside of my company. If you have constant churn because young people do not appreciate or do not value their company's perspective on this type of engagement, that's an expense to the company. And that came from a young woman who wants to volunteer and work with me and work with my team. This piece here, the CSD, so again, for those of you who are in the field of social work, I'm at WashU in St. Louis, the Center for Social Development, many of you might be aware of, but it's a group in the think tank that's focused around financial capability. These are the types of projects that we're pushing towards. So while I'm responsible, again, for some of the things that I've mentioned, like volunteerism, employee engagement, philanthropy, and grant making, what I'm mostly responsible for are finding leverage partnerships where we can take our resources and drive different outcomes. Now, again, you see a lot of companies and are mostly known for their philanthropic endeavors, but you're seeing more and more of them become known for who they are and how that impacts those who are from vulnerable communities. This is a space, if you're in a credit company, that we should be in, because we're gatekeepers for your financial health. And this is why I asked about rent before. I came down here from a 2-day conference of my own that I put together. We brought in 45 different national leaders who are focused on rent solutions, as we're calling them. So while I asked those of you who rent to raise your hand, did you know that paying rent consistently and successfully does not build your credit historically? I didn't know that. Do you guys know that? It's shocking to me, right? So you can have a home loan and pay consistently, and that boosts your credit. But you can pay your rent month in and month out, and it doesn't boost your credit. That's impossible to understand, right? And in the wake of the 2008 financial meltdown, rent prices have skyrocketed, less home mortgages. There are a lot more renters. There are 30 million low to moderate income renters in this country alone. And their rent is not counting towards building their credit. And if their credit's not increasing, they can't have access to a lot of the financial tools to live out financially successful lives. So we are making investments around tenant screening as well as rent reporting. So we see a lot of fintechs in this country right now very much focused on how do we collect renters' data to then provide to the credit bureaus so they can score all of you and get you to build credit based off your very successful payments around rent. So this is technology. So, and again, when I was listening to Carl, and I know talking with Jim and some of the different faculty down here, you know, the problems that I see that NGOs have are primarily around capacity and then technical skills. Equifax has about 900 data scientists. How many NGOs can you think of that have data scientists on staff? They're not trained to do it. They can't afford to have them. Yet again, we all are always talking about an evidence-based approach, right? A data-driven approach to poverty amelioration, to any sort of effective mission outcome. So we have these capabilities. We're not the only company that does, of course. We're all aware of the Googles and the Amazons of the world. They are equipped. We all are equipped with the infrastructure and technological acumen to drive NGO success. So again, for me, when I run into any of you in the field, I don't want to talk about giving you philanthropy. I know that NGOs are driven by funding, but I want to talk to you about how our data and technology can help you better assess right up front. When you say to somebody, this is our mission, this is how we'll execute, we can help you define that and measure it and then get you more money. That's not going to come from us, but we can use our technology and data to do so. I bring this one up too. Have you guys read Evicted? For those of you who haven't, I would. It's an amazing book. Came out in 2017. I think it won the Pulitzer or was a finalist. I reached out to Matthew Desmond, the writer of it. You know, it's essentially multiple accounts of property rentals in Milwaukee and the issues that people face around eviction and how it's driving poverty in this country. So I didn't reach out to Matt, who's now at Princeton, to offer him funding from Equifax. I reached out because Equifax is in possession of the U.S.'s largest employment database. So we cover 95% of this country. We know if you're employed. So if you're focused on eviction, and we know that housing is tied to income and working, we can then provide Matt and his team with the data to better do a deeper dive into what this means for our country. And I also put this up here because I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think very boldly. I mean, poverty, as Carl pointed out, it's been around for a long time. And a lot of the solutions that I see, at least from my vantage point, they're not working. So I tried to work with Matt. It's not working right now because of privacy issues, which shouldn't surprise anybody. But what he needed at Princeton and what we could offer, they didn't sync. So this, to me, is still a place where we should try to go and be bold and leverage partnerships, but they often don't work. And you should be prepared for that as well in your careers, too, because the things that you often try that you think are going to be most successful often aren't. And this is going back to a little bit to that rent piece, because it does tie to eviction. My world of work brings me into rooms like this, and the value that I take from it, and it's always a value, are the inputs that you provide. The social work mentality around all this, it needs to be married into the corporate thinking. To me, the fabric of corporate America has to change. I think it's slowly changing based off some different leadership models, based off a younger generation's desire to see companies do and be different. But again, for us, rent and rent reporting, tenant screening, essentially home. The idea of home, Equifax is in a position to drive stronger home situations and financial lives. And I could go through a number of different examples right now, but again, and I'll finish with this. I was supposed to have presented at the annual social worker conference that was in Disney this year, which of course makes me smile to think of thousands of social workers at Disney. But I couldn't eventually make it. But I produced this again with another MSW former student of mine, because to me, outcomes are very elusive. We all want them. Some people are achieving them, but it's usually always a collaborative process. So to me, I wanted to prevent a non-boring presentation at that conference. And it has been a treasure hunt, and it has been a journey for me. I've learned so much from social work students and MSWs, MPHs, faculty and staff from different social work schools across the country. So it all started for me, basically, though, about a decade ago, and the work that Jim referenced, which I won't go into too much depth, Social work students have provided inputs to me all along the way. Everything, and it'll make you laugh, but everything from Venn diagrams to logic models. The way that I explain my work is largely in terms of social work. And yet I work for a just massive multinational, multi-billion-dollar company. And it's working. And I would tell you as well that I wish more MSWs would actually consider my job. You heard my education. Does that qualify me to do this work? I mean, it really didn't. You know, I had to self-educate. I had to listen to really good friends and mentors like Kirby, who you're going to hear from next, and watch and just truly listen to better understand how to do this work. You know, we proceed, I mean, even the idea, if I were to go to my C-suite leaders at Equifax and say, hey, let's go listen to the communities in which we're doing work, let's ask them what they want from us. First off, they wouldn't show up. And secondly, when they did, they would hear negative things, and they don't want to hear that. But you all know that if we don't start there, the work that any of us does, it's just rendered moot, really. So Dean Clark was a critical stop along the way. That's Michael Sheridan out of the CSD in St. Louis. And I'll finish with this before I hand it to Kirby. I'm currently working with an MSW in St. Louis. Name's Braveheart. Braveheart was formerly a deep water engineer for BP. And the story Braveheart told me when he first met me was, I'm like, why did you leave this? And Braveheart's story was that he was the one day he was ever late for work, a work that required a helicopter to get there, was the day that the Deepwater Horizon blew up. So Braveheart was going to be on that rig that day. That was Braveheart's job. Since then, Braveheart is now at the Brown School of Social Work. And what Braveheart is doing for me is taking a systems dynamic approach so I can better understand the fullness of our assets and how they can be applied to multiple environments around financial capability, but nearly always within a collaborative structure with nonprofit partners, with academic leaders, with other MSWs. So that's my presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Kirby.
Thanks, David. Just to let you know, by the way we're going to organize ourselves is we'll each speak, then we're going to pull our chairs in the middle, and we're happy to take questions at the end. So thanks, everyone, for making time for us today. We sincerely appreciate it. Just by show of hands, how many folks in the room have ever heard of a CDFI? Oh, good. At least a few. I'm here to tell you CDFIs are your partners, and I'll tell you a little bit about what IFF is in a second, but I really appreciated Carol's opening remarks and the fact that, as David articulated, social workers are our partners and we're your partners. And I think we spend a tremendous amount of time under-levering each other's goals and commitment. Number 5, economic justice and equity. It's what we are all about. But in many cases, folks wouldn't invite a CDFI to the table because they don't even know what it is. So I'm celebrating my 18th year at IFF. I'll talk a little bit about what IFF is in a second. But this just gives you a sense of what we believe in and what we're working toward. We are a multi-state nonprofit organization. CDFI is one of the tools that we use, which I'll talk about in a second. But fundamentally, we are working to support transformational community development with a fundamental belief in investing in all the things that make healthy communities and investing in people that support that work. And I really want to underscore what David said and what Carl also outlined is that it is our responsibility to listen to community and work with community. It's not us trying to convince community to work with us. So we have a tremendous sense of urgency, and hopefully you'll see this story over time. We just celebrated our 30th year, and we continue to evolve, and we're evolving with our sense of urgency to leverage as many resources as we possibly can to benefit community. I'll take you back first to our origin story, which is on the upper left-hand side, to Chicago in 1988, where a woman named Trinita Logue, who's our founder, was working at the Chicago Community Trust. And you can imagine at the trust, the philanthropy there, managing a number of family funds, that nonprofit organizations were coming to the foundation every day saying, we need money. And they'd say, do you want money for your programs or your facilities? Because you typically can't have both. And by the way, why aren't you going to the banks? And the nonprofits would say, we are going to the banks. But the banks believe we're in disinvested neighborhoods. They have no idea how to underwrite our programming. They don't understand what it means to run a homeless program or youth services or senior services. And even if they would, we're bound by appraisals. And what is the market value a health clinic in a disinvested neighborhood? What does the market say an early childhood program in a neighborhood that's perceived to be disinvested? And we say those are priceless community assets, and we can't bring that paradigm to bear. So our origin story starts off first with some seed money from the Chicago Community Trust to start off as a nonprofit loan fund. And we went out and created a tool that's laser focused on meeting the obstacles nonprofits faced. The first obstacle was appraisals. We're the only CDFI in the country, community development financial institution, that's not appraisal based. And the belief is that if we underwrite in the same way banks do, we're going to do the same mechanical underwriting. We're looking at the same debt coverage ratios. But if we take that same approach, we're never going to effectively deploy capital. And we went out and we said, we want to align capital with justice. We want to make sure that money is getting into places where it's not going. We want to do this with excellence and rigor, and we want to leverage resources. So we now have scaled significantly. We get our money investments from banks. We get investments from national philanthropy. We get investments from hospital systems and religious orders. We blend that money and we get into the places where it hasn't typically been going to help prove the market and incent other folks to come to the places where they should have been in the first place. We realized though through that work, to the right-hand side, that 9 years into that work, by 1997, folks that have been involved in nonprofits know this really well, right? If organizations run into a facilities challenge, it typically falls on the shoulders of the senior leadership or board with mixed results. We believe as a nonprofit, we want folks laser focused on high quality programming, high quality healthcare outcomes, high quality education outcomes, high quality outcomes for the individuals that are served. So in 1997, we created a fee-for-service real estate consulting practice that brings a nonprofit partner to bear to manage facilities projects on behalf of nonprofit organizations. And then you start to think about the corresponding relationship between those two things. The more loans we make and the better we understand real estate, the more they can inform each other and being driven with a nonprofit lens. We've done research since our inception. This is typically needs assessment work that's commissioned by states, municipalities, or foundations. And we typically look at absolute need in the areas of early childhood education and K-12 school systems. And this isn't just, do we have a supply versus demand analysis? This is really thinking thoughtfully about how to empower communities and stakeholders with tools to direct resources into community to move the needle the most. As we continue to evolve, and we continue to evolve, at the intersection of all this is really community development, where we start to work in engagement with community and identify areas of high need. There are two examples of food deserts in Illinois, one in Rockford and one in Waukegan, that were persistent food deserts. And we worked it with stakeholders and we couldn't get anyone to really solve the issue, so we built 2 grocery stores. We own those grocery stores. We lease them to operators in those 2 communities. We built 200 units of housing in response to the consent decree in Illinois. Folks were not giving true housing choice. They were being institutionalized. We went out and built, in partnership with the Center for Independent Living, housing that we own as a responsible landlord that really achieves the objectives of universal design, energy efficiency, and provides people with dignity and being able to live in the community of their choice. At the intersection of this with these intentional feedback loops, logic models, right? The idea of shared information is where we work carefully. So I'm going to talk broadly about systems. I'm going to dig into early childhood as an example, and then I'll come back out. But this is just an overview of our work. We've now done over 1,700 loans across the Midwest. We work in 9 states, 7 cities. We have 2 partnership offices. I have an office in Chicago and Detroit. I live in Detroit. And our goal really is to take this first tool we had, this CDFI tool. So just a quick primer on CDFIs. There are CDFIs all across the country. I would encourage you to go to a website, ofn.org, the Opportunity Finance Network, ofn.org. There's a CDFI locator. You can find out which CDFIs work in your community. I ran it for Florida really quickly. There's scores of CDFIs that work in Florida. Invite them to the table, be in dialogue and conversation, and make sure that we find ways to work. Essentially, CDFI legislation was passed in 1994 by President Clinton, and the job of CDFIs is to really bring capital into places where it's not going to serve disinvested communities. There can be CDFI certified community banks, CDFI certified credit unions, CDFI certified venture capital funds, and CDFI certified loan funds, and we're a nonprofit loan fund of those choice. There are approximately 1,000 CDFIs across the United States. So they're working in every community in lots of different ways. They're leveraging billions of dollars to bring to bear into community. And it's really important to think about them as potential partners. Part of our journey took us to the strategic plan. This is a snapshot of our strategic plan from this past year that said, on the far left-hand side, okay, we've done 1,700 loans across the Midwest. And that's great, and each of those loans had tremendous impact and power, and I could talk a lot about those over the course of time. But ultimately, when we look at a lot of our neighborhoods and communities, they look the same. And so we challenged ourselves to say, if we were much more thoughtful about the interrelated nature of the work that we're doing, and we challenged ourselves to think much more holistically about systems and systems work, how might we be able to help move the needle? So we started to think about the intersection of not just our transactions, but how can we work in a collaborative way? How do we layer in what we're calling vital services, or this idea of systems work? And ultimately, how do we serve communities in a much more broad way at the invitation of and accountable to community with our comprehensive place-based work? So the idea of the Social Impact Accelerator, which is now 1 year old, is to take people using data and deep sector knowledge to proactively respond in the areas of development and transformational community supports. And we want to think much more holistically about how we approach this work. So really quickly, I'm going to dig into early childhood education. These are just some examples of the needs assessments that we do. Essentially, it's spatial analyses, and again, we're trying to figure out areas where we can move the needle the most. And the intent is to help move beyond anecdotes and have data-drive systems work, right? Bring you some stories from Detroit. So when we first got to Detroit, I moved to Detroit at the end of 2013 to start our operations from scratch in Michigan and Ohio. And we were faced with a lot of anecdotes around the early childhood system. You may remember at that time, it was the biggest, well, between 13 and 14, the biggest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States. There were a lot of things going on in terms of frayed infrastructure, physical infrastructure, fraying, social infrastructure, fraying, although the people of Detroit are the most unbelievable people I've ever worked with. We wanted to help move beyond anecdotes to the idea that it's all family, friend, and neighbor care, that people are making bad decisions or poor decisions, or it's all an underground system. And we also wanted to highlight what we were starting to see. So Carl challenged us, I think, really appropriately. We could make an economic development argument about the importance of early childhood education, but we want to focus on the human side of that, right? So most folks know that 90% of all child brain development happens in the first 3 years. Most folks are familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood experience, and the extent to which trauma really informs, it goes to this gentleman's question earlier in terms of the impact that folks can have. Thinking about toxic stress and some of the challenges that can happen. Children from low-income households with low incomes are 2 times more likely to repeat grades. They're 10 times more likely to drop out of high school. And to tell you how significant the challenge is in Detroit, even with the last update, 48% of children in the city of Detroit live in poverty. 48%. So if we set aside the economic argument, which we can believe is true, that we think it'd be great if folks could work and kids could have, and so that they would have stability, we believe that children should have access to full day, full year, high quality care, and we should be investing in children. That's an important investment to make. And so we made the case to philanthropy. Our first study was paid for by the Kresge Foundation, that we need to make an investment in the system. And we need to move beyond a very bifurcated system. I don't know how many folks are early childhood experts, but many of you have children or know people who have children. The system in Detroit is still a very siloed system. You have a half-day early Head Start classroom over here. You have a half-day afternoon Head Start classroom over here. You might have some private pay over here. You might have a pre-K program over there. Detroit has no public transportation to speak of and the highest insurance rates in the country. And we say to families, why aren't you doing right by your kids? Why aren't you getting kids in these programs? It's almost impossible. The system is working against folks. So even if we don't buy into the economic argument, if we think about the people argument and the investment in the future, it's incredibly important. So again, here's this CDFI coming to the table. Kresge's like, what's a CDFI? They knew, but why are you here leading this conversation? So I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about the research. I know this is very difficult to see. These are all on our website, and we do these all across the country. But basically, the shading represents the acuity of need in communities. The color coding dot represents quality. So in Michigan, the Quality Rating Improvement System, great start to quality. The far right-hand side represents provider type. We want to think holistically about systems, center-based care, home-based care. We're agnostic about the delivery, but we believe in quality. And we want to get a better picture of systems and systems work. And so I think what's incredibly important was this challenge of the community to start having data drive the decisions. The acuity you can see is up toward 8 Mile and beyond to the north. It's assuming people go out to Grosse Pointe on the east, and assuming people are going to the suburbs on the west. And we challenged the community and we said, we think this is an incomplete picture because people move across space all the time. We went back to philanthropy, the Kellogg Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan, and the Colina Foundation, and said we need to take a holistic view, looking much more broadly about the inner 3 counties of the Detroit metropolitan area to get a better handle on systems. This highlighted a couple of things. I'm sure you're all familiar with Brookings' work on the suburbanization of poverty, but there's definitely patterns of suburbanization of poverty in and around the metro area, and ideas of cultural competency. And what is the intersection between cultural competency, suburbanization of poverty, and meeting a holistic view of family needs? We came up with 5 recommendations in our Detroit study. 3 were policy recommendations and 2 were facilities recommendations. And I'm going to come back to this because people are thinking, what do facilities have to do with early childhood education? How does this all fit together? But we recommended that we have to move to a full day, full year system. We have to increase participation in our quality rating system so we achieve those objectives. But in order to do so, we have to invest in providers. It is unreasonable to expect that folks manage all the things you're managing every day and have to achieve those other objectives without additional supports from philanthropy, from government, from business, from each other, perhaps, right? And our 2 facilities objectives were, there were many, many facilities in Detroit that had high-quality programs in spite of their space, right? Facilities were a detriment or detracting from high-quality programming. And the bar was so low that we believe we need to build an exemplar center to try and shift the paradigm around facilities in Detroit. We believe that facilities should reflect the dignity of the people that are in them every day, so that when people are in this space, they have, if it gets too cold in here or too warm in here, we start to feel uncomfortable, right? Now imagine going to a basement that doesn't have good air quality, that may not be accessible, that may not have the right lighting, that may have primary colors on the walls. It all connects, right? And it's really incredibly important to think about those principles. So we collaborate with stakeholders on some of the policy issues, and we lead on some. This is an example of the paradigm that we built in Detroit to start to work on the system. On the far left-hand side, we said, okay, if we want to invest in high-quality providers in spite of their space, let's come up with a carrot, a micro-grant program. So Kresge gave us $150,000, where we partnered our real estate expertise and our early childhood expertise and our real estate expertise, and we worked directly with providers to identify their most urgent need in facilities and help them execute on those. But on the far side, we have these exemplar centers. What ultimately we're currently underway with a $17 million new construction center on the northwest side of Detroit, but that's not achievable for everybody either, right? People have to see themselves an opportunity all throughout the system. So we expanded to micro and macro grants. We've now had more than $3 million of investment from multiple foundations that's flowing through us. I encourage you to go to the website and look at iff.org/learning spaces. You can learn about that program and some of the innovation there. We also realized that we have to try and help tackle community issues. We have abandoned schools. We have abandoned commercial buildings. How can we innovate on adaptive reuse strategies so people can think much more thoughtfully about possibility? That's not always the marquee $17 million site. And we also wanted to do a demo lab. We want architects, engineers, social workers, teachers, educators to be able to come in and interact around best practice in facilities and see what's possible and applicable in all kinds of settings. And the idea is we start to think holistically. We started to develop a shared understanding of what this looks like, articulated on the far left-hand side. We had an embedded journalist working with us to develop a shared language around quality and facilities and the link between those two things. And at the center, we've now had multiple early childhood summits. I encourage you to check that out. They're free. We'll have it in Detroit again this year. And the idea is to then have a shared conversation, so we can build networks and cohorts working collaboratively together to help support the system. So if you think about this as a feedback loop, we're working to build cohorts and peer advocates. We're working to shift the paradigm and beliefs. We're working to increase standards. And we're also working to encourage our peers to work holistically in this space. There are so many SBA lenders and even some CDFI business lenders that when we send them an early childhood provider, they don't even see that as a business. They don't even know what to do. And so we have these incredible, mostly women of color leading early childhood in Detroit that have no access to capital because they're facing a variety of obstacles. And so we're challenging our colleagues to work on that. Really quickly then, we worked with the Kellogg and Kresge Foundation as a response to this data on a project called Hope Starts Here, hopestartsheredetroit.org. Hope Starts Here is Southeast Michigan's 10-year community plan focusing on early childhood education. And the idea was to say, how do we think holistically as a community about an interactive process? So IFF managed a one-year process. It involved 18,000 community residents participating in the planning process to develop a roadmap for our community. And we want to think holistically about mapping the system. This has got 6 imperatives. The third is sort of cut off right there. It's a little hard to read, so I'll just go across the top. Promoting the health, development, and well-being of Detroit children. Supporting parents and caregivers as children's first teachers and champions. Increasing the overall quality of our system. Guaranteeing safe and inspiring learning environments for children. Creating tools and resources to better coordinate our system. And finding new ways to fund. And what was important about this is now philanthropy is challenged. They're challenging each other to align around this wheel. And the idea is that if you invest outside of this or you can't connect your work to the imperative, it's underscoring the disconnects rather than saying how we're fully leveraging this. So you can imagine if we have the Detroit Public Health Department or hospital system working on the first 1,000 days, but nobody's thinking about the quality of the facility or nobody's thinking about the workforce, we're going to fail. Conversely, if we have someone focused on a great facility, but we don't fix the funding model, that's going to fail too. It's all interrelated. If we have great quality and parents don't know how to access it or advocate for it, we're going to fail. And the idea is to think holistically about a systems approach. How do we advocate and organize around systems to improve the overall landscape? So the idea is for us to have constant and intentional cross-functional work with our new part of our program. We want to tackle systems obstacles to support people, to help alleviate poverty, of course. We repeat this concept and model with K-12. We're doing a lot of work in K-12 systems, in food systems and social determinants of health, and thinking thoughtfully about this. So one of the things I wanted to highlight just as I close, and I pass it on, is to understand that there are all of the actors in and around the system, the obvious ones and the not so obvious ones, all have a role to play. And we tend to be exclusive in our conversations. I don't understand what a CDFI does. Why would I invite them? We're part of our coalition. We even challenge Head Start providers to think beyond Head Start as the be-all, end-all, and thinking about Head Start as a funding resource within service of full-day, full-year care for children. And so when we think about, do banks have roles? Absolutely. Do the hospital systems have a role? Absolutely. Religious orders, they have a role as well. Government, CDFIs, nonprofits. We have to expand corporations, right? Who would have thought? But if we don't take this approach that says, let's cast a slightly wider net and let's challenge folks really to lever everything they can and live into the promise in service of community, we are really doing a disservice. So when we think about proposed solutions for alleviating poverty, it's this holistic, coordinated view where we're holding each other accountable and challenging people really to think much more broadly, getting out of the silos and working collaboratively to leverage resources. So with that, I'll hand it over and we'll take questions at the end.
Hello. Hello. Are you still out there? Okay. I'm Jenny Jones, and I am just really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you this morning to really talk about the work that my two colleagues just shared with you, how it all comes together in an academic setting. I want to thank Jim. Where is he? Oh, hey. Yeah, I want to thank Jim for the invitation to be a part of this panel. This work is really, really important to me. I like to think of it as my life's work. I started out as a kindergarten teacher many, many years ago and moved into child welfare. And now and became a faculty person, and now as a dean, I still hold some true values around this work. And so I'm going to share a little bit with you about myself, how I kind of got to where I am, and then I'll move through to talk about this project that we have in collaboration with via Equifax, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to share that with you. As Jim said, I am the dean at the Whitney M. Young Junior School of Social Work. I've been there since 2016. I am the former director at Florida A&M Department of Social Work. I established a partnership with the Center for Social Development in 2014 while being on faculty at FAMU. And I want to share this story with you that kind of speaks to the description that Jim gave you about myself. When I was prior to becoming the director of the program at FAMU, I was over the MSW program, and we received a call from the folks at the Center for Social Development in St. Louis to talk about this great new curriculum that they had developed that was funded by Wells Fargo, and it was aimed at really trying to work with underrepresented groups, HBCUs, MSIs, and Native Americans around building financial capability. Well, my director at the time said, well, we don't think this is the best program for us, and they're not offering enough money to move this along, so we just turned it down flatly without really knowing a lot about it. So after a year later, I became the chair of the program. I went back to revisit that call to the folks in St. Louis. And after talking with them and hearing about the program and them explaining to us the whole goal behind this, I said, well, we would be interested in knowing more about it. So they flew me and a couple of faculty members out to be a part of a 3-day training to introduce this curriculum to us. And I tell you, it was the best thing that happened to me. And I'll tell you more about that as I move through. And in my role as an academic, I have been a professor of social policy since 2001. And again, this is just a part of my life's work. My philosophical perspective. Well, you know, this work that I do, I think, promotes the core values of the social work profession, particularly as it relates to economic justice. And there are 3 values that I have identified here that I want to just talk a little bit about you. And for those of you in the room who are social workers, you know clearly what these values mean. First, the value of dignity and worth. You know, social workers really should respect the inherent dignity and worth of all people. We should treat persons in a caring and respectful fashion, be mindful of individual differences and cultural and ethnic diversity. The second one, social justice, one that I'm very passionate about. We should challenge injustices. That's what we should be about. We should pursue social change with and on behalf of vulnerable and oppressed populations. Social change efforts are focused primarily on issues of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and other forms of social injustice. And lastly, human relationships, which is everything, because you can't begin to make change in any environment without understanding the importance of human relationships. We should understand that relationships between and among people are important vehicles for social change. How many people in here are familiar with the name Whitney M. Young, Jr.? Yay! Okay. I am very proud to serve as the dean of the Whitney M. Young Junior School of Social Work. Whitney Young was a part of the civil rights movement. His whole focus was around economic justice. He served as dean for then the school, Clark Atlanta University, prior to being named Whitney M. Young, and then left there and went on to work as the executive director of the National Urban League. Whitney Young also was an advisor to President Johnson on the War on Poverty programs. So that's a really big thing to me, because when I think about his work in the 60s and move to where we are in 2019, much of what has changed is just the years, because we're still fighting for economic justice. So the school prepares social work professionals with knowledge and skills really to address culturally diverse human and social issues, locally, nationally, and globally. Our framework for the school, our perspective for the school is grounded in the Afrocentric perspective. We believe very much that this model affirms, codifies, and integrates common cultural experiences, values, and interpretations that cut across all people of African descent. the intersectionality of race and other societal factors such as gender, ethnicity, social class, and ability, and sexual orientation is all a part of the Afrocentric perspective. And of course, it acknowledges the African cultural resiliencies as a foundation to help social work practitioners solve pressing problems. The Afrocentric perspective is not only for African American people or people of African descent. It can be used with any underrepresented group of people. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, because oftentimes when we talk about this perspective, people think that it's only related to African Americans. I want to switch to talk a little bit about our programs and centers. The School of Social Work we have 3 levels of programs, and of course our field education. Our BSW program, of course, is our generalist practice program. We have a master's program with the clinical concentration in child and family and integrated behavioral health. I tease my faculty all the time because I always say that I am a macro girl and I'm going to macronize y'all. Just a matter of time. And we have a PhD program that focuses on leadership, administration, and policy. And our field education program, which of course encompasses both our BSW and MSW program, is central to our community partnerships. This is where our school meets the community. And it's really an important part, a huge part of who we are and what we do. We have a center, the Center for Children and Families. The center has been around for about 10 years. It was pretty dormant for about 8 years. It's been within the last couple of years that we have relaunched it, and we focused our initiatives again around health and well-being of African American children and families. We're guided by the Afrocentric perspective. The center does direct practice, training, research, and policy commentaries related to health, mental health, and community practice. Community partnerships. This is where people like Kirby and David come into play, and it's such an important part of the work that we do around community partnerships. As I mentioned, when I started, I met the folks at the Center for Social Development at Washington University back in 2014, and that's when I told you I went and reached out to them a second time when I became the director of the program at FAMU, and they introduced me to this curriculum. And when I got there, they shared with us that the curriculum really was designed for social workers and human service professionals to work with financially vulnerable populations. And we've heard a lot this morning about financially vulnerable populations. The curriculum was aimed to build students' professional capacity to work with households, financial institutions, and to improve the financial capability of low and moderate income populations. Now, when I moved to my new school at Clark Atlanta, I'm so excited about this curriculum and about this work, and I said to the people in the School of Business, I have this fabulous curriculum that I would like to share with you guys. Maybe we could team up and do some work around this initiative together. And they asked me to tell me more about it, and I told them it was grounded in social work values and social work principles and so forth. And so they said, well, we already do financial literacy with poor people in the community. And I said, well, what does that look like? Oh, we help them with their income taxes. And I said, well, that's not helping folks build assets. What we know is when we help financially vulnerable families do income taxes, and they get, a lot of the families get earned income tax credit, so some of them get back a pretty nice chunk of money. But if we don't help them learn how to manage that money and plan with that money, in 30 to 45 days, they have no money. And so that's the point I was trying to get over to them, that this is where social work could help you, help families around understanding the importance of credit scores, understanding the importance of building some type of financial stability, understanding how to think about saving for their children. Because with these families, I think well, let me back up. Every parent, I'm not a parent, but I'm going to take a leap of faith and say, every parent wants what's best for their children. Would you all not agree with me? You want to see your kids do well. Well, if we're not, and you want your kids to have better than you, if we're not willing to invest in families in a way to teach and guide them around how to even think about money, we're never going to get there. We'll hear those stories that Kirby just shared with us about the brokenness of Detroit before they got there, the early childhood piece around, with kids not having a coordinated system of care to get them through the system. That's what happens when we don't work with families in these ways. And I think social workers are key to do this type of work. The curriculum also came with some technical assistance regarding implementation of implementation. Now, the curriculum is huge. It's divided into like 4 different parts. So you can't offer the entire curriculum in one setting, but it has so many different small components that you're able to pull out pieces that would fit within the particular class that you teach. It starts off asking, helping us understand why social work and financial capability? And that's a very fundamental question. I have a clip here, if I can get this right. Wow. This is where my students usually come in and help me. Hear that?
Everyone needs financial capability today. When I was a child growing up in a small Kansas town, a lot of families could just operate with cash. They could just pay their bills around town and never have to really have a bank account, never have to have credit, could just function in a cash economy. That's no longer true today. People who don't have good credit and operate with credit, and people who are not capable of handling pretty complex financial situations are at a great disadvantage. The world, in short, has become very financialized.
This curriculum, not only is it teaching people about, teaching our social work students the value of making sure that people are ready to take care of themselves and become financially included in the mainstream of finance and things like that, but it's also a way of awakening something in them that they haven't thought about before.
Once you learn how to manage your money, understand debt, learn how to do a budget, live on a budget, you can then start to think about how to build assets. You can't teach people how to build assets when they really don't understand how to budget, how to get there. So I see this as being huge in this profession. We're onto something here. I think the folks at the Center for Social Development over at WashU have really kind of taken us outside of our normal way of practice, and I think that's going to be very important.
We want to empower individuals. We want them to be self-sufficient, and we want them to be to provide them with the right tools to succeed in life. So I feel that with the financial aspect of social work, we're doing the same.
As a public housing case manager, the big part of my job was help families gain the economic security they need to no longer be in public housing anymore. I was wholly unprepared for that part of the job. Had I had this kind of curriculum as an undergrad, I would have been so much more helpful for those families. I didn't have all the skills I needed to move them forward. This curriculum is going to give people those skills, that information, so they can do that for their families.
Being able to talk to a client in helping to set a budget. We don't realize how much we spend on things that we don't need.
The way our society operates is really financially based, and a lot of individuals in their current situation, whether they're struggling with home life, addictions, getting a job, the institutions out there that they might be a part of, finances are a huge player. And so I really feel that there's a high importance to at least understand the basics.
Clients in crisis are in a special, particularly teachable moment, because it's at that point that you start thinking about how you might want to lead your life differently. And if a social worker is right there when a client is in crisis, and they already have the knowledge, the background knowledge about how to assess for credit, how to eventually, how do you build wealth, even if you're low income, what are the kinds of programs that would help you to build wealth? If the social worker already comes with that kind of background knowledge, then they can also be there to catch and to guide their clients.
At present, we have 12 partner colleges and universities. 9 of them are historical black colleges or tribal colleges. We're very fortunate to have support from Wells Fargo Advisors, which is the primary funder for this project. They've been terrific funders, have shown a lot of interest and a lot of expertise that have helped us develop this project.
I'm going to move pretty. Uh-oh, I just messed up something. Oh, okay. I'm going to move pretty quickly because it's almost lunchtime. But I wanted to share that with you just so you could get an idea of how this curriculum looks in the classroom. But I want to move quickly to talk about, I'll skip this slide, to talk about our partnership with one of the community agencies in Atlanta. And this is the internship model that we use to describe this partnership. Our partner, community partners, up on the blue, in the blue circle, On the Rise Foundation, and then our Center for Children and Center for Children and Families, and then the community in which all of these operate is the historic West Side. So I thought this was really an important piece to share with you. I'm going to try to get the pointer here. I'm doing something wrong. Anyway, I'm going to deviate for a minute, told me to walk over to make my point here. When we look at the historic West Side of Atlanta, this is one of the communities. This area is one of the communities that has been. It's one of the last communities in the Atlanta city proper to go through this whole gentrification process. Now, the West Side extends further on, but this particular area is has been one of the hardest hit communities in Atlanta. So over the last 10 years, what we've seen in this community has been, that the blighted properties, families who were working families who had jobs moved out some years ago, left many homes kind of boarded up. People kind of moved out of high crime, high drug area. So it just kind of sat there. But what's important for you to know is like right about here, there's a street that runs like right about here around Vine City and Atlanta University Center. It's called Northside Drive. So that's the street that separates that side of that area of the West Side from downtown Atlanta. So you can see right here, this is where downtown Atlanta sits. Well, this is the big new stadium, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Next to the Mercedes-Benz Stadium is the Georgia World Congress Center. On the other side of that is the aquarium. On the other side of that is the Centennial Park, and then downtown. This is a 5-minute, the Vine City area and the Atlanta University Center is a 5-minute walk to the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. I wanted to point that out to you because I think it's important for you to know how all of this comes together. Now, years ago, back in the 60s, this area, the historic West Side community, was the center of the birthplace of leaders in the civil rights movement. This was an area of the city that they congregated, worked together on. And then the Atlanta University Center, where my school is located, has the largest conglomeration of HBCUs in the world. They all converge right there. The Sweet Auburn Avenue area, which is on the other side of the West Side, was the area that was known for an influential center for black wealth in the United States. Well, the side where the Atlanta University Center is was also known a vital center for black thought. This is where all of the professors that taught within the Atlanta University Center lived in that community. It was thriving. It was moving. It was important. The AU Center, as we call it, was very instrumental in the civil rights movement. So we have a place in history there. But what we're watching happen is a lot of that get eroded because the downtown area, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, is now encroaching upon that community. And we see people who those who have remained there being pushed out because new homes are being built that's far more costly than what these people can afford, and so they're having to just kind of go further, further, further back out of the city. And I wanted to make the point around this because when I was at FAMU, the bond community that sits around FAMU at one point in time was also a very thriving community where many of the professors that taught at Florida A&M lived in that community. So we had that black center of thought right there. And so we've seen that change. And when I introduced this curriculum to my students, I asked questions like, how many banks do we have in this community? Wells Fargo. What are the hours of Wells Fargo, operating hours for Wells Fargo? 9 to 5. How many grocery stores do we have in this community? During that time, the only one was down here, I can't remember the street, but it was Harvey's, and I think they closed, and now I understand they have another one. How many department stores do we have? And so when they started to think about what was lacking around them, and also started to think about understanding the whole issue around wealth and money and student loans, you see, another thing that brought me to this was my students at FAMU had the highest debt load of student loans in the state of Florida. And so I felt like I had a responsibility to help them understand financial capability, not just becoming literate in finances, but what does this mean for your life as you move forward? So that's how I have done this work. That's how it has guided my thinking. I'm going to share another quick, I got to move on. I can get carried away with this stuff. I want to talk a little bit more about that community, the Vine City West Side community. As you can see, Vine City makes up 23% of that community. The Atlanta University makes up 41%. Asheview Heights, 18%, and then English Avenue, 18%. Again, these are all communities right there together. The population, in terms of housing, 15,079 folks. There's households equal to be 6,333. Renters, 5,834 people compared to owners, 499. So I think you get the picture here. Very, I missed one. Okay. The partnership that we developed, the partnership that the Clark Atlanta University developed with the On the Rise Financial Center is really groundbreaking. We're so excited to be able to be in partnership with them. It's an internship program for our students, our Masters of Social Work students, and our students are having an opportunity to work with financial coaching with low-income families. Well, this has been such an eye-opening experience for our students. They have, again, they see a lot of this work that they're doing with the clients they work with, thinking about how it impacts their own lives. It's real-world application and its impact on economic well-being for individuals and families. So this is a picture of our students and the director. We have, with the support of Equifax and some other folks, we have been able to have some financial support for our students for paid internships. So again, we're pleased about it. On the Rise Financial Center started in April 2017. I've talked about the communities that are involved in this process. It's an initiative of federation in partnership with the local credit unions, and they're identified here. And of course, On the Rise is made possible through the support of lead sponsors like Equifax, Invest Atlanta, and the Arthur Blank Foundation. My closing statements: I believe that all persons deserve to have the necessary means to provide for themselves, to include financial security. They should have control over their day-to-day finances and have the ability to make economic choices and feel a sense of security, satisfaction, and personal fulfillment. I'll end with this quote: I am not anxious to be the loudest voice and the most popular. but I would like to think at a crucial moment, I was an effective voice for the voiceless, an effective hope to the hopeless. Thank you. And as you can see, when I started this work in FAMU, you saw my picture, my hair was not this color. So this is what happens with being a dean. I'm just wondering what it's going to look like next. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I hope that there'll be some questions in terms of the collaboration that can occur. Here's an empirical fact of what can happen where there are concerned, caring folks who are trying to address a problem. So if you have any questions, please come up. We're still setting up the food, so no worries, And we'll give you ample time to enjoy
Still plenty of reason
Vail
to be worried.
Restaurant. Please.
Hi, thank all of you so much for being here, especially you, Dr. Jones. My name is Mary Correa. I'm a recent graduate of the MSW program here at Florida State, and I've been working very closely with a very small group here in Tallahassee, the Tallahassee Community Action Committee, who was a part of helping the city from moving a $60 million brand new police headquarters to the south side of Tallahassee within walking distance of FAMU. So I don't know how much you pay attention to the things going on in Tallahassee anymore now that you've moved away, but we still want the community and the city to invest in the south side and create shared value and all of these things. It is a historically black part of town and economically depressed part of town. Everything you were talking about is just, and their solution was to build a police station. And so I wanted to kind of hear from all of you any advice, any information that you may have from your own perspective about that. So, super easy question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, when we think about building a police department right on the south side of the city where it's predominantly African American, that sets up some tensions right there because we know that there's been a lot of mistrust and a lot of things that have happened with the police and the black community. I think probably one of the first places to start is to engage the community around their feelings about it, because you got to start with where they are and how they feel about this, because if not, then we're going to have this tension is going to continue. The tension may continue for a while anyway, but the whole idea of community policing has been effective in some areas of the country, but we just got to be able to engage them and hear them. And I'm sure that that the precinct went up before folks had a chance to really talk about how they felt about it. So now we're coming after the fact, and that makes it harder. But again, engaging, I just think that this work is all about engaging people. You've got to engage them, hear them, and allow them to be able to say what they feel and what they think they need. And then I think there can also be some work done with the police department around helping them see what the community needs and how they feel about it. And it could potentially be a good partnership, but we have to start where the community is.
No, I don't know that. I know that the Tallahassee example, but one of the things that we think about is advocating for power structures to really be accountable and to embed that in their decisions. And so we see that most when they can influence each other. So in other words, it takes leadership within philanthropy, for example, to really hold organizations accountable for racial equity. And now Kellogg is a national leader in this, where they actually build it into their decision-making process, and they encourage their peers to do the same. As we do development, we're focused on equitable community development and building in thoughtful approaches to procurement, and the extent to which we can encourage corporations or municipalities to make decisions that way and make it the way of doing work is incredibly important, so that the only way things get built or done is through the voice of community and in participation with community, and oftentimes that it's so challenging to have that be a bottom-up, top-down process. Sometimes it has to be a peer-to-peer. And so the more that we can lift up best practice and maybe shame not so great practice, the better, I think, to try and help shift the paradigm.
Thank you. Please. Please.
I wrote down my question because I'll ramble if I don't. So, Kirby, this is for you. So, have you noticed a breaking point trend in communities that you've worked with? Is there something that is causing communities to say enough is enough and real and actual change needs to happen? Because despite Tallahassee being the capital, one of the most educated cities in Florida, and predominantly known as like a blue community, we have almost daily gun violence, community segregation, housing segregation, school segregation, a severe lack of affordable housing, even though we have a plethora of housing stock. We have food deserts. We have public housing waiting lists that last 5+ years. We're a hotspot for human trafficking, both for sex work and migrant farmers. And we have shelters that are riddled with controversy, local government riddled with controversy. Like, at what point is enough enough, you know? So we have research-based universities here. We have the data and the research that shows evidence-based interventions.
I hate to,
It's like 2 sentences.
if you would ask the question, because
What is the breaking point for a community?
Thank you.
Because I feel like we have 25 breaking points at this point.
Yeah, no, sadly, at least in the community, so we work exclusively in the Midwest, as I mentioned, and sadly, in our experience, it's been some sort of community emergency. So we do work in Flint, of course, and sadly, the water being poisoned and children being poisoned in Flint was enough of an emergency to get the community's attention. In St. Louis, it was Ferguson, and that was finally something that got the community to at least have a conversation about race, which was long, long, long overdue. And in Detroit, it really was the bankruptcy, and I think, sadly, if we wait until there is a true community emergency to start to tackle these issues, then we're scrambling in response. And so, I mean, it's a challenge in our Rust Belt cities in particular. And sadly, our experience has been without, even with organized folks working collectively to support solutions, sadly, our experience has been that sometimes it's a community emergency of some sort or the other, man-made or not, that unfortunately is what breaks it. I don't know if you.
So we have a time for, I saw this lady, that lady. Michael, were you? So if we could be succinct, this would be really helpful because I want to get folks to lunch. But we'd like to address some of the questions. But if you do it to the point, that would really be appreciated. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Megan Daigle, and I work with Legal Services of North Florida, so I'm an attorney. And so we work with people, just so you know, we do free legal services to all the counties all the way to Pensacola. So we've recently had a hurricane, as you know, and part of what we do, and I'm trying to keep this short, but part of what we do is help people, obviously in crisis, and we had a lot of people get notices that told them they had to leave and be evicted, and we helped, I'm sure, hundreds of people not get evicted, which is wonderful. However, that doesn't help them with the budgeting and the why they were there in the first place and why. And I'm talking about Section 8, I'm talking about tax income, I'm talking about private housing. So I'm talking about on the gamut. It's just a big problem that we've had. And I'm wondering what you all have seen in terms of collaboration. I was going to go through some of our individual things, but of course we're always asking them if they're eating or if they have other things that they need, medical care, all that kind of stuff. But it seems like they're silos, like you were talking about. And so when we send them out there, I love the social work idea, but I don't actually see it when the rubber hits the road happening.
We're actually focused on that right now. So obviously in the wake of natural disasters, people's ability to repay their loans gets impacted. So your credit drops. That's unfair. So I'm working with the other 2 bureaus right now on solutions around that because that's the foundational piece that people shouldn't be punished because of a hurricane. But then within that become the tactical solutions, right? The housing, the food, the emergency needs. But for us, the foundational belief is that people shouldn't be punished because of events beyond their control. But then within that financial pieces and working with partners who can get people back in housing and to work collaboratively across the different sectors.
So would you mind, because I want to make sure that the other 2 folks have a chance. Yes, ma'am.
I try to speak loud. My question is addressed to Mr. Burkholder. Going back to Detroit, you said that 48% of the children are in poverty, and that Detroit has the poorest transportation system in the country. When you created a new facility for these children that are now interrelated to get education, starting with preschool, how did they make it to that facility? I have this very practical question.
Sure. It's a great question, and I neglected to mention, when I show those maps, I hate to describe those as dots because those are actually like longtime community stakeholders. They're businesses. So nothing gets opened in a vacuum, right? Everything is introduced in an existing ecosystem, and we have to think holistically about that. So a quick answer is, because we're layering in data and real estate expertise, when we work with early childhood providers, we're thinking thoughtfully about what is the future city plan for Detroit? What are thoughtful access to public transportation routes to the extent that they exist? How will families get there? And how is the new program mix meeting need in community? So it's very much front and center. And it underscores the importance of, if this was just answering a facilities question or just answering a program question and it wasn't connected, we are exacerbating the issue, right? We have to think very thoughtfully about how we address the need now and then advocate real time for bigger issues. How do we support transportation? How do we support access, right? So I really appreciate the question, and I'm thankful for reminding me that, that there's no place that doesn't have assets, and people have been working very hard in the community. We need to think really thoughtfully about that.
Thanks. Mike, with the last question, please.
Try to make it short. Heard a lot of what, why, how do I get the corporate buy-in? Pretend I'm a VP from JP Morgan Chase. You caught me on a good day. What's your elevator speech?
How would you get money from my corporation is what the question? Or a corporation? You know, sure, and it's hard, right? Because NGO leaders are pushed every day to find the funding to commit to the mission that they're pursuing, right? First and foremost, the scattershot approach to getting corporate funding is what repels corporations. If it's not a mission fit, you should be very careful in approaching corporations because it wastes your time and theirs, and that's how they're going to see that. Most people in my role in leadership in corporate America, they feel their time is very taxed. They don't take into account that you're also very busy. So succinctness, knowing what they do, I'm shocked in the ask that we get every day because it has no whatsoever is it a shared value. It's sort of an implied, you should do this because you're a corporation and where you should be guilty by your very existence, and that's not good enough. You know, so showing that you know what I do, what we do as a company, and then how that would match with what you're trying to accomplish, that's the easiest way. I think you'll find a lot of really good, thoughtful people who want to make new partnerships work.
I said 45 seconds. I know we're not a corporation, but we work with some of the biggest banks in the country, and it really is about their self-interest and alignment. One of the challenges we have is we do a really terrible job of telling our story through acronym soup. And the story of investing in early childhood centers could be a story about facilities. It's also a story about health. It's a story about jobs. It's a story about economic development. It's a story about stability. And we have to be much more nimble in the nonprofit space to be able to reframe and discuss comprehensively the way we tell the story and identify, to your point, what's their area of self-interest, where are we aligned, and how is our work actually promoting the work that they do. So if you look at in Detroit, JP Morgan Chase made a massive announcement in Detroit that was very much connected to the work of CDFIs as a tool. So if you start to look at how corporations talk about those kinds of major investments in community, you can start to see where those connections might be and find yourselves and your work hopefully in that space.
I'm
just
sorry.
want to underscore one thing that David said that I think is critical because I hear folks ask all the time about the elevator speech. You got to know what the corporation funds and what they do and the mission of that corporation and how it aligns with what you're asking for. That's the catch. Because if you don't have that piece, they don't even hear what you have to say.
Folks, it's a delight to know that so many of you have been engaged by asking very thoughtful questions. So we're going to have an exciting presentation after lunch. Please enjoy Vail and be back in about 45 minutes. Thanks so much.